From businesses to infrastructure, ransomware attacks are on the rise around the world. We'll discuss the growing problem and efforts to stop cyber criminals. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Over the last few months, there have been a number of ransomware attacks on businesses and infrastructure. In May, a critical U.S. oil pipeline was targeted, forcing the company to temporarily shut down operations. That led to panic buying and a fuel shortage in the northeast United States. In June, a U.S. meat company was forced to pay $11 million to resume its operations after cybercriminals took its plant offline. And in July, hundreds of supermarkets in Sweden that rely on software from a U.S. company were forced to close because a cyber attack crippled cash registers. For more now on the ransomware attacks and the global impact, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Shenzhen is James Sung. He is the chief strategist at Zocus Strategic Marketing, a Chinese-American firm. Also with us from Beijing is Einar Tangen. He's a political and economic affairs commentator. From London, Klisman Murati is the founder and CEO of Pangaea Wire Group and a global geopolitical advisor. And from New Jersey, Dan Ives is the managing director and senior equity research analyst covering the technology sector at Wedbush Securities. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And Dan Ives, let me start with you in New Jersey. The United States, as I said, has faced numerous cyber attacks over the last few months, and it's reportedly cost these companies something like $1.4 billion just last year. We call them ransomware because the perpetrators demand money, but how exactly do these things work?
Yeah, I mean, this is really, for someone like myself that's covered cybersecurity industry for decades, I think this is probably the most pronounced threat that we've ever seen. And really the way it works is that they ultimately, through some vulnerability, attack a network, ultimately get that data, and almost put it in a vault and say the only way you could have that data back is if you pay the ultimate bad actors. And I think that it's a scary attack that we saw with Colonial. And I think the issue is that with more and more data and applications on the cloud, more vulnerabilities, there's more at stake. And ultimately, that really is going to increase the ransomware attacks. And that's why we're seeing right now a cybersecurity industry that's $1 trillion industry, because this becomes the worst nightmare for any CEO to be a part of a ransomware attack.
And Dan, you mentioned the petroleum pipeline attack that was Colonial. Of course, we look at other things like infrastructure, the electricity grid for that matter. I mean, to what extent do these cyber attacks pose a threat to a country's national security, whether it be the United States or any other country in the world?
Oh, I think it's front and center. I think this starts to become a threat from a national and international perspective to municipalities, to cities, to countries, because of utilities, grids, and ultimately the core infrastructure. And as more and more, and this is an important point, as more and more is ultimately accessed through the cloud, whether it's through the enterprise infrastructure, there's more vulnerabilities. And the more digital transformation hits, there's ultimately more vulnerabilities, and that's just put more and more threats out there. And that's why I think what we're starting to see, Colonial Pipeline was a wake-up call, I think, to many in the Beltway. And I think it really was a shot across the bow that shows that this is not going to stop. It's going to continue. The threats, and that's why cybersecurity and the guardrails need to be put in place.
James Sung, as far as we know, these attacks are coming from individuals. They're not coming from states, although there are some state players that may be involved in these kinds of attacks. But how big a problem is this globally?
Well, certainly it's affected, so many of these corporations that we just heard about. It's even affected my parents. My dad opened an email, and he's in his 80s, and he downloaded some software, malicious software, and then his laptop was held for ransom as well. He had to go to 7-Eleven, buy a gift card, and unlock his computer that way. So it's really widespread. We really don't know where it's coming from. This could just be teenagers in the U.S. It could be, guys in in Russia, it could be Germans. We have no idea where these attacks are coming from. I mean, this is the internet; it's wide open. And what's notable is the internet started with 4 billion IP addresses, and today, with the new protocols, there are 340. Let me see if I'm pronouncing this right. Undecillion IP addresses, and that means trillion, trillion, trillion. So between bouncing IP addresses, proxies, bot networks, and CPUs that can do 120 trillion calculations per second, there's really no way to track where it's coming from. Of course, there are breadcrumbs, but are these breadcrumbs set up by the hackers to mislead you? Is it just a smokescreen? The most successful hacks, I think, are the ones we don't hear about.
Mm-hmm. And James, as Dan pointed out a moment ago, protecting oneself from these attacks is a huge industry right now, $1 trillion industry, he told us. But how do companies protect themselves from this?
Well, first of all, we need to stop blaming other people. We need to really just look at our own infrastructure and take responsibility for our own security. How many of us listening right now have not changed their router password before? How many people? Is there a router password admin123? It's that's the default setting that comes from the factory, and I would say like 90% of people don't change that. Human failure is really one of the biggest issues in cybersecurity, and not updating service packs. And then there's recently we heard about in the UK, the National Health Service had this program to collect COVID test results, and because they were using outdated software. I think they're still using like Microsoft Excel 97, which only allowed like 65,000 fields. They were missing so much data, and that's why their COVID results calculations were off. So, there's a lot of these silly type of things that should not be happening, but that are happening, even on a national level like that.
Well, that was the education, James. I didn't even know my router had a password, but I want to go to Einar Tangen right now to get the picture from China. Einar, of course, this is a universal problem. Countries all over the world are being affected by it. What kinds of measures is China taking to protect the country and its companies?
Well, China's been fairly robust in this field. They've been looking at personal data protection. They've put in laws that are going to make it illegal for companies to kind of harvest your personal information unless they specifically get it in writing something from you. So that's part of it. But, there's not much you can do when you have things like Pegasus out there that are zero exploit things, and that simply means that you don't really have to do anything, and they can get at your phone and therefore your passwords and your private information. China's also, since 2013 has promoted this idea of a sovereign internet. Now, back then it was poo-pooed. Everyone said this is terrible. This is just another cyber wall in addition to all the other ones. But it now has become the trend. Countries realize that what comes in and out of your country is your responsibility. And you're starting to see that all around the world. But what's really needed here is a revamp. I mean, you just heard how many IP addresses, a trillion, trillion, trillion IP addresses. The architecture of the internet has evolved, but the rules have not. And there has to be a concerted effort, and this is global, to kind of address this. The other part is what's allowing all of these ransomware attacks, and it's being aided by these crypto coins, the ability to anonymously pay people off. Right. And China has taken a very firm stance. They're kicking out all the these crypto miners, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if you start addressing those issues, you can don't have to deal with all the symptoms of this kind of crime.
Klisman Murati, great to have you with us. Welcome to the show. One other question is, if we look at the situation that took place recently, the United States asked the Russian government to do more to stop cyber attacks. There was an attack against the United States, we are told, by the White House, and that this attack emanated from Russia. What responsibility do states have to stop these kinds of attacks? Doesn't it raise all kinds of questions, legal questions, issues of sovereignty, etc.?
Yeah, that's right. It's a very good question. I think that's a two-part answer. Now, on the face of it, legally, states have every obligation to stop any illegal activity happening within their borders, whether it's state actors or non-state actors. That's just their responsibilities as states. However, strategically speaking, states have responsibility to themselves to remain powerful and to fulfill their agendas. And throughout this process, naturally, states do use the technology of the day to allow their agendas to be met. So they're essentially working on two different levels at the same time, which isn't really helping the cyber security infrastructure, because naturally states will do what is in their power to get their agendas met. But on the face of it, they need to do what they need to stick to international laws and international treaties to keep everything above board. So they're really operating on two different levels at the same time, which shows the contradictory nature of international world affairs and geopolitics.
Klisman, one other point that Einar Tangen just raised a moment ago, he talked about the Pegasus software, which is sold by an Israeli company, and there have been huge question marks over whom that software was sold to, because it was sold to some countries which have been used against human rights activists, etc. How does one regulate who sells these things and to whom they're selling them?
Well, if you ask Pegasus, the operators of Pegasus, they'll obviously give you the most politically correct answer and say that we obviously sell these to nation states who meet a certain criteria of ours. Everything's above board and legal, but really companies like the ones that created the Pegasus, they're not the only ones. You don't need a legal entity to create cyber capabilities which are beyond the scope of legality. As one of your guests mentioned before, you have teenagers in their bedrooms who can create systems which break into your computer and can cause a lot of damage. So on the legal front, on the company front, I think companies which created softwares like Pegasus are needed to see what the capabilities are above board. But naturally, it's like an iceberg where only the tip of the iceberg shows when things go wrong. But as one of your guests mentioned, the best cyber attacks are the ones that you don't notice until the attack has happened, and by that time it's too late to capture who the perpetrator was.
Dan Ayers, of course, it's not just infrastructure that's been targeted. Companies have been targeted as well, as we mentioned in our introduction. In Sweden, some 500 supermarkets were forced to close their doors when hackers attacked the software that runs their cash registers. And that software actually is made by a company here in the United States, in Florida. We've heard of cases like that in the United States as well. I think we remember it was quite some time ago, but we remember when hackers got into the Target database. That's Target, the big, huge department store, which is all over the country, and obtained personal information from that. What can be done to stop that?
Yeah, and then, even when you think more recently, look at the SolarWinds attack, which happened late last year, which was really a global issue. Look, I think it really comes down to, many companies, I'm talking about enterprises, that they're just not prepared when it comes to their infrastructure that has the cybersecurity, the next-gen cybersecurity that's proactive and enough to at least ward off most of these attacks. I think that's part of the problem, is that cybersecurity as a percent of IT budgets is about 5 to 7%. We believe it needs to really be close to 12 to 15%. So I think you've seen some companies, that, especially a lot of banks, retail, call it a lot of Fortune 500 companies that are really now, especially with the shift to cloud, have started to significantly increase investment in cybersecurity, but many lack it. And I think that continues to be the best defense, especially for enterprises that are shifting to the cloud at a feverish rate.
And Dan, what about the impact these kinds of, they have an impact on companies like we see with this Swedish company? Its supermarkets has to close its doors, so there's no money coming in, there's no business being done here. But what about the impact on customers, as we see in the Target case, where they obtained information?
Well, that's the biggest issue in terms of data breaches from a branding perspective. The last thing a company wants to do is have to send that email out to its millions of customers talking about data breaches. And it's not just the legal issues, it's about what that does in terms of trust and brand. Because there's two components here. There's the consumer piece, and then there's the enterprise piece. And as one of you guys talked about, I mean, these are only the cyber attacks that we hear of. The vast majority happen, but we don't even hear about them. And I think more and more what this means is that this is really now a board issue, from boardrooms to CEO down. And if you ultimately cut corners in cybersecurity, you ultimately risk not just monetization, but potentially the company's brand. And that is something that I think is becoming more and more front and center, as we've seen even over the last 6 months.
James, what are your thoughts on these cyber attacks and the impact it has on businesses and their customers? I mean, the security breach that we talked about against the Florida company, it affected more than 1,500 businesses in 17 countries. This is a big deal. I mean, can you give us a sense of how these attacks impact people and businesses?
Well, it's across the board. Every kind of business is being affected. I mean, of course, we heard about the oil pipelines. There was the meat supply chain, and there's MSPs that are being affected, managed service providers, which provide protection against from cyber attacks for companies. These are third-party IT companies that are out there to service companies. But when the company that's protecting you gets attacked, then that's where the hackers have access to thousands of companies under this umbrella. Now, a more recent attack was the Microsoft Exchange hack, which affected email accounts for a lot of large corporations. And what's really worth noting, and what's really raising eyebrows, is that the FBI, in an attempt to solve the problem, quote unquote solve the problem, they actually got a warrant from a federal judge to go into everyone's email accounts and delete the malicious software without their permission. So people are being notified after the fact, after the FBI is reading their emails and saving them from the hackers. So I wonder if this is maybe a pretext for well, I don't want to say too much on TV here, but it's very suspicious. Let me just put it that way.
Dan, is that a risk that state actors could act maliciously against people using the cover of law?
Look, I mean, in my opinion, I think this is one where a lot is going to come out over the coming years in terms of these threats becoming more and more from nation state and from actors. And there's going to be more people and enterprises involved. And I think that continues to be the biggest risk.
Einar Tangen, if we look at some of the global efforts to counter this, the United Nations has launched 2 initiatives on cybersecurity. One involves a group of experts, there's another group to which a number of countries belong. But, I mean, could the UN be more proactive and perhaps be looking at some kind of global legally binding agreement with all member countries to stop this?
Well, I refer to my the other colleague on the show, Mr. Klisman, that simply it won't work. You have different tracks going at this. It really is a structural issue. No offense to the cyber experts, but quite frankly, it's good, for them if there's a lot of crime out there because they get to solve it. But quite frankly, the internet has been successful and added to society because it's more efficient. Adding more costs onto that takes away that efficiency. This is a structural issue. If you simply had, real name registration and also real IP registration, and you change the structure of the internet, it would be a lot easier. Now, there will be concerns about privacy. Those can be addressed domestically and internationally as part of the restructuring, but you cannot kind of continue on with this kind of mess that's been created by the internet and say, look, we're just going to deal with the symptoms on a case-by-case basis. I mean, what has happened here with Snowden, it was revealed that the U.S. government, and ironically, all the people who are in NATO who are accusing China of all these bad things, they were in fact processing each other's information and were doing a massive worldwide intelligence operation illegally against their own domestic laws, and that was actually settled in the U.S. in September 2020 when the U.S. court said that what Snowden had revealed was illegal. And this despite protestations by, for instance, both Obama and Cameron, who were saying that this was, national security and that nothing could be touched. So as long as you have these dual tracks out there and there's no attempt to address the structural issue, you're not going to go anywhere except spending more money.
Klisman, I know you want to say something about this, but when we're looking at some kind of international agreement, I mean, what do you do with countries that adopt cyber attacks as part of their national security strategy?
You have to understand the way that the world works, Anand. We have created a system, an international game, where there are laws and regulations that govern our behavior. But these laws and regulations aren't created mutually beneficial. Meaning, nations will never agree on something which limit their own power to act in the international sphere. So when it comes time to cyber, naturally no nation wants to be hacked, but they also don't want the legal restrictions of them using cyber capabilities against another state player, another state actor, or non-state actor. So you'll continually have this push and pull in international law between nations when they try to figure out what the standards should be in international law. And this has happened since the very beginning of international law. From the beginning of even outer space law, when they restricted how you should act in outer space, to international maritime law, to now sort of cyber security. The Tallinn Manual, I think, is the best place to start legally to find out what a state's responsibilities are and how legally cyber should be understood. But beyond that, it's the legal judgment of a nation state, and also building that consensus against a state actor which is not acting in compliance with international law, to build that case internationally, and then to respond in kind to that national actor who isn't acting within the international boundaries, to stop them from behaving that way. But we'll continually have this game because these are the rules that we have set as an international community, naturally ourselves. So we're going to play within them and also out of them when it suits the nation state itself.
Dan Ives, I want to get back to something, I think it was you who mentioned it earlier in the show, and that was when we look at the bad players, these guys who do this for money, ransomware attacks, they normally want to be paid in cryptocurrency. I mean, these are largely unregulated financial instruments. How does that work when you can't track cryptocurrency? But we do know that in one case, I think it was the Colonial Pipeline case, the law enforcement authorities in the United States were able to retrieve some of the money.
Yeah, and that was significant that they were able to retrieve some of it because, as you talked about, it's unmarked, and really crypto has fueled part of this, right? If you look at the sort of underground market, and especially when it comes to cyber attacks, ransomware and crypto kind of go hand in hand. And I think it's one of the shames about crypto because there's so many other good uses in terms of blockchain and from a technology perspective, but it's used by many bad actors. And at the end of the day, when the ransomware attacks, the more money they make, it fuels more ransomware attacks, and it becomes sort of almost a spreading brush fire, and that becomes the issue for enterprises, for nation states, and really municipalities. And there have been many municipalities that have been victims of ransomware attacks, and I think that's a scary proposition that I think speaks to what we're seeing in today's environment.
James, we also hear politicians talk of cyber warfare, and it's sometimes referred to as the wars of the future. But can a cyber attack be as lethal as, say, a nuclear bombing?
Well, it certainly can, but think that's somewhere that nobody wants to go. But what's notable is it's not just states that have control of this power nowadays. You have these hacker networks, you have Anonymous that are decentralized with hundreds, thousands of hackers. You don't know who they are, what their agenda is. Ransomware is, they're here for money, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's better that they're just here for the money and not for our data. So this is something that
Right.
all nations need to get on. It's something that that we need to watch, and it's something that I think doesn't have an easy solution right now.
Right. Klisman, your company issued a global power index on 26 countries and highlighted 6 sectors, and among those sectors were financial strength, geopolitical positioning, and technological leadership. Give us a breakdown on those things, how you looked at them, and what exactly do they, how do you stratify these things?
Sure, that's a really good question. So what we aim to do with this Global Power Index, and it's the first index of its kind where we measure a nation on what we call their centers of power. So what we're saying is that there are 6 centers of power every nation possesses that they can use to their advantage, depending on what level they are. And you just mentioned 3 of them right now. So it's geostrategic positioning, technological leadership, and we have financial strength, we have an active consumer market, and a nation's military balance. And as part of that, we're saying that these are the 6 areas in which a nation can grow and develop. And using our proprietary methodologies and our measurements, we are able to calculate each individual nation and how they rank on these 6 sub-indices, and then put them all together to create a super index called the Global Power Index, where nations as well as investors can have a chance to see where a nation ranks on them, where the opportunities and drawbacks are for investing in a specific nation.
Yeah.
And this is the sort of flagship sort of measure for nations and for companies to see how powerful nations are. And in terms of the technological leadership aspect, we see the United States ranking top, China ranking around 9th, and Russia ranking around 15th. This doesn't only measure cyber capabilities, but that's only one type of measure, which is important to this conversation at least.
So the ranking, Klisman, measures a country's vulnerability, right?
So it measures their globalized power. So it measures at this very moment in time, depending on what year you're looking at, how robust are they in their power, and also what vulnerabilities do they have, naturally as part of that as well.
Okay. All right, we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for an interesting discussion. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.